My name is Walter Beckman. I am 70 years old. I live in Preston Hollow, on the north side of Dallas, Texas, in a house I built with my own two hands the year my daughter was born. 4 days before my only child was supposed to walk down the aisle, I stopped by a bridal and formal wear house in downtown Dallas for the final fitting of my suit. The owner, a man I had trusted for 25 years, took one look at me, went white as chalk, locked the front door, and dragged me by the arm into a pitch-black fitting room at the back of the shop. He pressed his mouth close to my ear and whispered, "There are things you need to know. Hide in here, do not make a sound. Trust me, I was confused, I was angry. But I stayed quiet. Minutes later, the voices that drifted through that thin mahogany paneling froze me where I stood, because on the other side of the wall, my future son-in-law was calmly, casually planning the murder of my daughter. Before I tell you how I tore that man's world down to the foundation, do me one small favor. Tell me in the comments what city you're listening from tonight, and if stories of justice are your kind of stories, subscribe, because I promise you, you have never heard one quite like mine. I spent 40 years as a structural engineer. I built commercial towers across Texas, Dallas, Houston, Fort Worth, steel and glass reaching for the sky. In my profession, you learn one truth early, and you never forget it. A building almost never collapses without warning. There is always a hairline crack somewhere in the foundation, quiet and patient, long before the whole thing comes down. My entire career was spent finding those cracks before they found me. But God help me, I never saw the crack running through the middle of my own family. Not until I was standing in the dark of that fitting room with my ear pressed against the wall, listening to the devil describe how he was going to kill my little girl. Let me take you back to the beginning of that week. My daughter's name is Claire. She was 32 that spring, and she was the center of my universe. Her mother, my Eleanor, had passed away 7 years earlier, cancer, quick and merciless. And after we buried her, Claire was all I had left in this world. She ran her own contemporary art gallery in the design district, and she was good at it, genuinely good, the kind of good you cannot fake. And that spring she was happier than I had seen her since her mother died. The reason for that happiness was a man named Nathaniel Sterling. Nathaniel was 35. He drove a European sports car the color of wet ink. He wore suits that cost more than my first truck. He introduced himself as a tech investor from an old money family back east. Providence, Rhode Island, he said, a family estate, boarding schools, yacht clubs, the whole gilded resume. He had a smooth way of talking that always felt 1 degree too rehearsed to me, like a speech he had given before. But Claire looked at him the way her mother used to look at a summer evening. And what is a father supposed to do with that? You swallow your cynicism. That is what you do. You tell yourself that your suspicion is just grief wearing a disguise, that no man was ever going to be good enough for your daughter anyway. I wanted to believe he was a good man. I wanted it so badly that I agreed to pay for the entire wedding, 150 guests at a grand ballroom in downtown Dallas, because I wanted to give my girl the world, the way I had promised her mother I would. That Tuesday afternoon, 4 days before the ceremony, I drove my truck downtown to Marino's, a bespoke tailoring and bridal house that has stood on the same corner for a quarter of a century. Salvatore Marino is a master tailor, an artist with a needle, and one of my oldest friends. He had fitted me for every important suit of my adult life. He had fitted Claire for her wedding gown in that same shop just 2 weeks earlier. When she chose Marino's for her dress, Salvatore called me personally, and I could hear the old man smiling through the phone. But when I walked through the glass door that Tuesday and the little brass bell chimed above my head, Salvatore looked up from a bolt of dark silk, and every drop of color drained out of his face. He crossed the shop floor faster than a man his age had any business moving. He flipped the sign in the window to close ad. He turned the deadbolt, and before I could get a single word out, he gripped me by both shoulders. His hands were shaking. I could feel them shaking, and he steered me toward the back of the shop, into the deep VIP fitting room, the one with the heavy velvet curtain and the solid mahogany walls. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Stay in the dark, do not make a sound. No matter what you hear, Walter, trust me." Then he shut the door and turned the key from the outside. I stood there in the blackness, furious, bewildered, half convinced my old friend had finally lost his mind. I raised my fist to pound on the door, and then I heard the front door of the shop unlock. The brass bell chimed again. 2 sets of footsteps came down the hardwood, unhurried, confident. And I recognized both voices before they had finished their first sentences. It was Nathaniel, my future son-in-law, and with him was Renata, his older sister, or so we had all been told. She had flown into Dallas the week before to help with the wedding preparations, all warm hugs and champagne toasts. They stopped in the lounge area directly beside my fitting room, separated from me by nothing but an inch of decorative wood paneling. I held my breath in the dark. I told myself it would be something small. Money trouble, maybe. Some embarrassment he wanted to bury before the wedding. I was a practical man. I stood there in the dark, preparing myself to solve a problem. I was not prepared for evil. Nathaniel spoke first, and the voice that came through that wall was not the voice I knew. Every ounce of the warmth, the deference, the easy charm he wore around Claire and me, gone. What was left was flat and cold and amused. He gave a low laugh that turned my stomach, and he told Renata they didn't need to waste time on fabric swatches. He said, "The old man is completely clueless. He'll sign the medical power of attorney at the rehearsal dinner. He thinks it's just a trust package to save on taxes." I pressed my ear flat against the cold wood, my brow nodding in the dark. We had discussed a family trust. That part was true. Estate planning, protecting Claire's inheritance. But a medical power of attorney had never been part of any plan I agreed to. Why on earth would Nathaniel need authority over my daughter's medical decisions? Then Renata answered, and her voice was a razor drawn across glass. She said, "Good. The moment the ink dries, the $10 million life insurance policy goes active." And then she said the sentence that stopped my heart inside my chest. "Claire will not survive the hiking trip in the Alps. A tragic accident at altitude, and you'll be the grieving widower holding every card in the deck." Nathaniel chuckled. He agreed it was a beautiful plan. He used that word, beautiful. The air in my lungs turned to ash. My legs nearly buckled underneath me, and I had to press both palms flat against the mahogany just to stay upright. Because my mind was already racing back through the honeymoon plans, how Nathaniel had insisted, on a remote high-altitude trekking excursion near Zermatt, in the Swiss Alps. How he had sold it to everyone as the romantic adventure of a lifetime. How my Claire, who hates the cold, who has never climbed anything taller than a stepladder, had reluctantly agreed just to make him happy. He was going to push my daughter off a mountain, and he needed my signature first, so that when she was carried into some foreign hospital on life support, I would have no legal right to intervene, no right to her care, no right to bring her home. They stayed in that shop another 5 endless minutes, and I stood in the dark and listened to them discuss, calmly, the way other people discuss dinner reservations, the fastest way to liquidate my commercial real estate portfolio once they controlled my daughter's estate. 40 years of my life, every tower, every beam, every sacrifice, divided up between 2 strangers over fabric samples they never intended to look at. Every word landed like a sledgehammer against the foundation of everything I had ever built. I did not move. I did not breathe. I stood in that black little room and I let the shock burn all the way down. And what it left behind when it finished burning was something colder and harder and infinitely more dangerous than rage. The bell chimed. The door closed. They walked out into the Texas sunlight. Salvatore unlocked my door a moment later. He was sweating through his shirt, and he looked at me with an expression I will carry to my grave. Pity and terror braided together. He had overheard them once before, he told me later. A phone call Nathaniel took in the fitting area during his own suit appointment. Careless, arrogant, certain that a 70-year-old tailor was part of the furniture. Salvatore hadn't been sure. And then they had booked another appointment for that Tuesday, and he had seen me walking toward his door at the exact wrong moment, and he made a decision in 3 seconds that would end up saving my daughter's life. I did not say a word to him. I could not have formed one. I gripped his shoulder in silent gratitude, and I walked out to my truck. I sat behind the wheel with my knuckles white against the leather, and I made the first mistake of this entire war. I let the father act before the engineer could think. I did not call the police. That much at least I got right. I had no recording. No document. Nothing but my word against a charming millionaire's. And I knew with sick certainty that Claire was too deep under his spell to believe me. But instead of going home to plan, I slammed my boot down on the gas and drove straight across Dallas to my daughter's building, my chest full of fire, fully intending to kick her front door off its hinges and tear the truth out of Nathaniel Sterling with my bare hands. I parked in the fire lane. I marched past the concierge. I rode the elevator to the top floor with my heart pounding against my ribs like a pile driver, and I shoved her door open so hard it cracked against the wall. Claire gasped and dropped a stack of wedding invitations across the hardwood. And Nathaniel was sitting on the sofa with a glass of sparkling water in his hand, and he did not flinch. He did not startle. He did not spill a single drop. He just turned his head and looked at me with those calm, empty eyes, the way a snake watches something small move through the grass. I crossed the living room in 3 strides. I pointed my finger in his face and told him I knew. I demanded answers about the medical power of attorney. I demanded answers about the $10 million life insurance policy, about the sudden urgency of a hiking trip in the Swiss Alps for a woman who has never hiked a day in her life. I turned to Claire and I begged her to get away from this man, because he and the woman calling herself his sister were planning to kill her. I was braced for him to stammer, to rage, to swing at me. Any of those I could have handled. What Nathaniel did instead was the most frightening thing I have ever watched a human being do. He sighed. He set his glass down on a coaster, and he looked at Claire with an expression of deep, wounded sympathy. Then he stood, opened his hands like a man surrendering to an unreasonable child, and he began gently, patiently to explain me away. He walked to his briefcase and laid a stack of legal documents across the kitchen island, smoothing the pages flat with manicured fingers. The trust package, he explained, was standard procedure for high-net-worth families entering a marriage. My commercial real estate holdings exposed Claire to a brutal estate tax liability. He quoted the federal rate. He cited thresholds and exemptions. He handled the jargon with the fluency of a corporate attorney. The medical power of attorney? A routine rider the lawyers attach automatically, he said, designed to protect Claire if anything ever happened to me. He turned my own accusation inside out and handed it back to me, smiling. I brought up the life insurance policy. I shouted that $10 million on my daughter's life was a motive for murder. He did not even raise his voice. He produced letter on bank stationery and explained, with his hand resting tenderly on Claire's shoulder, that the policy was a lending requirement. The private bank insisted on it to secure the mortgage for the home he was buying for their future. A financial safety net, he called it. He made a death warrant sound like a love letter. And the Alps? He smiled softly, almost bashfully, and told Claire he was sorry the surprise was ruined. It was a fully guided luxury tour, he said, professional guides, oxygen support, 5-star chalet. Not a climb, a honeymoon. Then he played his final card. With sorrow, this man. And he asked quietly why I hated him so much, that I would invent a murder plot 4 days before the happiest day of Claire's life. I turned to my daughter, desperate, and started to tell her about Salvatore, about the fitting room, about every ice-cold word I had heard through that wall. And when I looked into Claire's eyes, my heart broke in a way it had not broken since the morning her mother died. Because the girl looking back at me was a stranger. Her face was flushed, her hands were trembling, and every ounce of her fury was aimed at me. She stepped in front of Nathaniel. She shielded him from me. She said I had lost my mind. She said that ever since her mother died, I had grown paranoid and suffocating and controlling, that I was trying to burn down her happiness because I was terrified of being alone in my old age. Every sentence was a blade, and every blade found the softest part of me, because the cruelest lies are the ones wrapped around a sliver of truth. She said I had spent my whole life building cold steel structures, and now I couldn't stand to watch her build one beautiful thing of her own. She pointed at the door, shaking, tears running down her face, and told me not to come back until I was ready to apologize to the man she loved. I stood there and looked at the two of them, my daughter sobbing into his chest, and Nathaniel holding her, stroking her hair, murmuring comfort. And over her shoulder he looked straight at me, and he smiled. It was a small, slow, private smile meant for an audience of one. The smile of a man who has just won the first battle and wants you to know it. That smile saved my daughter's life. Because in that instant, I understood exactly what I was dealing with, and I understood that if I kept swinging in the open, I would lose her. First to his lies, and then to those freezing mountains. You cannot bring down a fortified structure by throwing your body against the wall. Any engineer will tell you. You find the stress points. You work in silence, and you let the structure's own weight destroy it. I walked out of that penthouse a defeated old man, in their eyes. In mine, I was already drafting the demolition plan. I did not sleep that night. I lay on my back staring at the ceiling of my empty house, forcing my wounded pride to kneel before cold logic. And by sunrise, I had my sequence. Every controlled demolition begins the same way. First, you survey the structure. Then you find the load-bearing lies. Then you place your charges where no one will ever think to look. The next morning, I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. I picked up the phone, I called my daughter, and I lied to her. I let my voice tremble. I made myself sound small and old and broken. I apologized for my outburst. I blamed it on grief, told her that the thought of giving her away had cracked something open in me that had never healed since her mother's death. I swallowed 40 years of pride in a single phone call, and I begged my own child for forgiveness for a sin I had not committed. Claire hesitated. I could hear the suspicion in her breathing. But my daughter's heart is good. It is the best thing about her, and it is also the thing those two monsters were using against her. She softened. She invited me to Sunday brunch at the country club to clear the air. She told me, with a tenderness that put a knife in my ribs, that Nathaniel was the one who had encouraged her to give me another chance. Of course he had. Magnanimity is cheap when you're 4 days from $10 million. Sunday came in blinding and hot. I walked onto that patio in a tailored jacket and a carefully constructed mask of contrition, and I shook the hand of the man who was planning to murder my child, and I said thank you when he pulled out my chair. And then I stopped talking, and I started measuring. Because here is what Nathaniel Sterling did not understand about the tired old man across the table. For 40 years, my living depended on seeing what other men miss: a hairline fracture and a foundation pour, a weld a half millimeter thin, the one flaw in 10,000 square feet of perfection. Deception is just another kind of structure, and every structure has flaws. The first crack showed itself within 20 minutes. Nathaniel was holding court about his childhood in Providence, the boarding schools, the regattas, the family compound on the bay, and he rested his left arm on the white tablecloth so the sun caught his watch. A vintage gold Rolex, he announced when he saw me looking. His grandfather's, a family heirloom from a titan of industry. It was a beautiful watch, from a distance. But my eyes have spent 4 decades catching millimeter discrepancies in steel from 50 yards, and as he reached for his water glass, I watched the second hand move. A genuine vintage Rolex carries a mechanical movement. The second hand sweeps smooth as oil in one continuous motion. His second hand ticked, one stiff, cheap little jump per second. Quartz, a counterfeit movement in a counterfeit case on the wrist of a counterfeit man. A titan of industry's heirloom with a $40 heart. I nodded along to his stories and filed it away. A few minutes later, when the plates arrived, I let my napkin slip off my lap. I bent down to retrieve it, and for half a second, I glanced beneath the table. What I saw down there turned my blood to ice water. Renata, the devoted older sister, had slipped off her high-heeled shoe, and her bare foot was resting high on Nathaniel's inner thigh, her toes moving against his leg in a slow, intimate rhythm that no sister on this earth has ever performed for a brother. They were that comfortable, that certain of their victory. The foolish old man across the table was already furniture to them, the way Salvatore had been furniture. I sat back up with my face perfectly blank, and my heart slamming, and I turned my attention to the third person at that table. And that was when the fear truly arrived. Claire had barely spoken 3 sentences the entire brunch. My daughter, who once talked for 45 straight minutes about a single painting, sat slumped in her chair, her skin pale to the point of translucence, staring at her untouched plate through eyes that would not focus. When the waiter asked if she wanted a refill, she blinked at him, as though the question had reached her from underwater. And Nathaniel's hand slid over hers, smooth as silk, and he answered for her. "Wedding exhaustion," he said warmly. "She just needs rest. She was not exhausted. I have seen exhaustion. I have worked 80-hour weeks in 100-degree heat. This was chemical. They were drugging her. They were keeping my daughter in a fog so she would smile and nod and sign whatever paper they slid in front of her. And so she would be too weak, when the time came on that mountain, to fight for her own life. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to flip that table, to drag her out of that club by force, to demand a blood test in front of 200 witnesses. And the engineer in me clamped down on all of it, hard, because I had already run that calculation. No proof. A counterfeit watch and a half-second glance under a table. Claire, sedated and loyal, would defend him. The police would see a paranoid old widower making a scene. And Nathaniel would know I was hunting him. And he would take my daughter somewhere I could never follow. And he would finish this early. Acting on impulse would have signed her death warrant. So I smiled. I laughed at his jokes. I kissed my daughter's cold cheek in the parking lot and waved as that ink-black sports car carried her away, a captive princess behind tinted glass. The moment they turned out of the drive, the smile fell off my face like a mask cut from its strings. The survey was complete. Now it was time to place the charges. Monday morning I put on a plain jacket and a baseball cap and drove to the main branch of my bank in downtown Dallas. I bypassed the teller line, sat down across from my private wealth manager, and told him I needed $100,000 in cash. He looked at me with careful concern and asked gently if I was in some kind of trouble. I gave him a tired smile and told him I was making a confidential investment in a private venture. In a manner of speaking, it was the truest thing I said all week. An hour later, I walked out with a leather duffel bag over my shoulder, and I drove to a plain office building on the industrial edge of the city. I was not shopping for the kind of private detective who photographs cheating husbands through motel windows. I needed a ghost, someone fluent in the architecture of financial fraud, someone who could walk through paperwork the way termites walk through pine. I had made quiet calls to old contacts in commercial construction, men who deal with corporate espionage the way the rest of us deal with weather, and every one of them gave me the same name: Everett Shaw. Everett was a federal financial crimes investigator for 15 years before the Bureau and his methods came to a disagreement. The Bureau kept the pension. Everett kept the methods. He worked out of a sparse office with a metal desk, and when I dropped the duffel bag on that desk and unzipped it, he glanced at the money the way other men glance at a parking receipt. He leaned back in his creaking chair, looked at me for a long moment, and asked one question: "Who are we destroying?" I told him everything: the fitting room, the medical power of attorney, the insurance policy, the counterfeit Rolex, the bare foot under the tablecloth, my daughter's vacant swimming eyes. Everett listened without a single interruption, took a clean legal pad from his drawer, and said, "Then we're going to trace every breath this man has ever taken." But before we could move, I needed to buy us darkness. A predator like Nathaniel watches the people around his prey. If I stayed in Dallas asking questions, he would feel it. So I built him a diversion out of my own humiliation. I called Claire while I loaded golf clubs into my truck, and I let her hear the clubs rattle. I told her, in the flattened voice of a beaten man, that our fight had shaken me to my core, that I was flying down to a golf resort in Florida for a few days to clear my head, so I could walk her down the aisle with a genuine smile. I could practically hear Nathaniel relaxing in the background. The old bull had been led out of the arena. The last obstacle had removed itself. That same night, Everett and I were on a plane. Not to Florida. To Providence, Rhode Island, the seat of the storied Sterling family fortune. The address on Nathaniel's incorporation documents led us through the gray New England drizzle to the northern edge of the city, and when we pulled up to the coordinates, Everett slowly closed his laptop, and neither of us spoke. Because the registered home of Sterling family capital, the old money estate, the compound on the bay, was a dead strip mall. Rotting plywood over the windows. A ruined storefront that used to be a discount liquor outlet, its awning sagging toward the pavement like something ashamed of itself. Nathaniel Sterling was not a tech investor from an old New England family. The man sleeping under the same roof as my sedated daughter did not exist. Everett went to work right there in the rental car, the pale light of the screen carving shadows across his face. The strip mall address anchored a lattice of shell companies, layered, patient, professionally built to exhaust any routine background check. But every shell company, Everett told me, no matter how clever, has to touch the real world in two places: a registered agent and a bank routing number that pays the filing fees. He fed that routing number into a specialized financial database, and the screen began to fill. Wire transfers, offshore accounts, dummy corporations nested inside dummy corporations. A river of stolen money, washed and rewashed, all of it draining quietly into one high-yield checking account in Dallas, Texas. That single account was the beating heart of the illusion. It paid for the ink-black sports car. It paid for the tailored suits, and the five-star dinners and the champagne. Every dollar of Nathaniel Sterling's golden life had been siphoned out of the savings of people who had actually worked for it. I leaned my head against the cold window glass while Everett worked, and I thought about my own 40 years. I did not inherit a cent. I started in steel-toed boots on wet concrete in 100-degree Texas summers. I missed dinners. I missed recitals. I missed weekend ball games I can never get back, because I was determined, obsessed, Eleanor used to say with love and exasperation in equal measure, to pour a foundation under my family that nothing on this earth could shake. And this hollow man, this parasite, who had never built anything, never made anything, never carried anything heavier than a forged document, was reaching for all of it with soft, manicured hands. The sadness burned off somewhere over that ruined parking lot. What condensed in its place was resolve, cold and structural. Then Everett let out a sharp breath, and his keyboard went silent. He had cross-referenced the shell accounts against a decade of arrest warrants, and the false name had finally cracked open like a bad weld. Nathaniel Sterling was an alias 4 years old. The man's legal name was Marcus Doyle. Convicted felon. 3 years in a state penitentiary in Nevada for a real estate fraud that specifically targeted elderly widows. A documented, court-certified predator, currently engaged to my only child. But Everett wasn't finished. His fingers started moving again, faster now, feeding the real name into a restricted records database alongside Renata's, chasing old addresses and known associates. A progress bar crawled across the screen, while the Rhode Island rain drummed on the roof of the car. And then a scanned document resolved on the monitor, an official state record, raised seal, 2 signatures, and Everett stared at it, closed his eyes, and shut the laptop with a crack like a gunshot. He turned to me and his voice was flat and absolute. "Walter, they're not brother and sister." He opened the laptop again and enlarged the document until the text filled the screen. It was a marriage certificate, Clark County, Nevada, filed 8 years ago. The first signature, Marcus Doyle. The second, Renata Doyle, the woman sleeping in my daughter's guest room, the warm, devoted future sister-in-law helping choose the flowers, was his wife. The sheer depravity of it broke over me like cold surf, and my mind flew back to that country club table, to the bare foot moving under the white linen, while my drugged daughter stared at her plate. Everett kept his voice low and clinical, and he laid out what we were actually looking at. A seasoned, itinerant grifter team with a fixed method. They hunted wealthy, emotionally vulnerable women, isolated women, grieving women, women starving for love. Marcus would build a bespoke identity and become the perfect suitor. Renata would arrive as the welcoming sister, supplying the illusion of family, disarming the last of the victim's defenses. And once the target was cut off from everyone who truly loved her, they took everything. But this time, Everett said, the stakes had grown teeth. Claire was not just a wealthy mark. She was the sole heir to a commercial real estate empire, and she was about to be attached to a $10 million life insurance policy. They weren't planning to rob my daughter. They were planning to erase her, and there was one more file. Everett had run a pattern search under the real name, unresolved police reports, accidental deaths, insurance payouts orbiting Marcus Doyle's known aliases across 10 years. He turned the screen toward me, and I found myself looking at a scanned newspaper clipping from Florida, dated 2 years back. Wealthy Harris drowns on honeymoon off Miami coast. Husband survives tragic accident. The grainy photograph beneath the headline showed a man on a dock with his face buried in his hands, a portrait of devastation composed carefully for the news cameras. The hair was styled differently. The name printed in the caption was different, but the jawline, the shoulders, the practiced grief, unmistakable. It was Marcus, perfecting his craft, 2 years before he ever laid eyes on my daughter. Everett read me the file in a flat voice. The victim, 32 years old, newly come into her late father's trust. Married less than a month, a private yacht charter, a wet deck, rough water night. By the time the Coast Guard reached the scene, it was over. The autopsy found prescription sleep aids heavy in her blood. Her brand new husband explained smoothly that she'd been battling wedding anxiety and insomnia. The death was ruled accidental. He walked away with $5 million in insurance money and a clean name to burn. 32 years old, the same age as Claire. He even had a type. The red rage I had been fighting for days went suddenly, strangely quiet, and in its place came a clarity so cold it felt like altitude. I was not dealing with a greedy con man anymore. I was dealing with a practiced, patient serial killer refining his method, and my daughter was his next project. A bigger payout requiring a more sophisticated stage. Not warm Miami water this time. Thin, freezing alpine air. But here is the thing about men like Marcus Doyle, and I want every parent listening to me to carve this into memory. Their genius and their doom are the same trait. Arrogance. He had done it before. He had gotten away with it clean, and so he had stopped believing that anyone in the world could see him. He looked across a brunch table at a tired old widower and saw a piece of furniture. He never once considered that the furniture was load-bearing. The flight back to Dallas was silent, and I used every mile of it to build. I was no longer a grieving father hoping to be believed. I was an engineer preparing to bring down a hostile structure from the inside, and I knew exactly which loads to cut and in what order. The first thing I needed was physical proof of the poison, and for that, I had to get into their apartment. Everett confirmed by cell tracking software what I'd hoped. Marcus and Claire were across town at a bakery for a final cake tasting, and Renata was at a boutique collecting alterations. The penthouse was empty, and it would not stay that way long. I want to be honest with you about how I got through the door, because it is the part people ask about. A 70-year-old man defeating a military-grade smart lock. The truth is far less glamorous than it sounds. I spent the last 15 years of my career designing the security and access systems for commercial high-rises. I have sat in rooms with the engineers who build these locks. I know where their maintenance bypasses live because I specified them. Marcus had bragged to me once about that lock, certain it made him untouchable. To me, it was a puzzle I had helped write the answer key for. I was inside in under 2 minutes. The apartment smelled of expensive vanilla candles. I did not waste a glance on the wedding gifts stacked in the living room. I went straight to the home office Marcus had claimed as his own, and I searched it the way I search a building, systematically, drawer by drawer, checking the false bottoms, finding nothing, because a convicted con artist does not keep his secrets in a desk drawer. He needs an anchor, something hidden, something structural. So I stopped searching like a detective and started looking like a builder. I measured the room with my eyes, comparing the interior against the hallway outside, and I found my discrepancy. The wall behind his desk was nearly 8 inches too thick. I ran my hand across the drywall and knocked, and 3 feet up from the floor the sound changed from a hollow echo to a dense, flat thud. Down along the baseboard, my fingers found an almost invisible seam. I pressed the edge of the panel, and a section of wall swung open on a hidden spring hinge. Behind it sat a fireproof steel safe with a mechanical combination dial. I knelt in front of it and pressed my ear to the cold steel. I want to be clear that I am not some master safecracker, but a mechanical lock is a machine, and I have spent my life listening to machines tell me their secrets through my fingertips and the side of my face. I turned the dial with agonizing slowness, feeling for the faint drag of the tumblers, listening for the microscopic clicks as each pin settled home. First number. Reverse second. One last turn to the right, a third click, and the handle gave. The door swung open on the dark inside. I reached in and drew out a small black tray. On it sat a cheap disposable burner phone, and beside the phone, an amber prescription bottle stripped of its pharmacy label, wrapped instead in a strip of white masking tape. In blue ink, in Marcus Doyle's own careful hand, the tape read, "Claire's Supplements." I unscrewed the child-proof cap with shaking fingers. Inside were heavy, unmarked blue capsules. These were not vitamins. These were the chemical chains he had wrapped around my daughter, 1 dose at a time. I tipped out exactly 2 capsules and buried them deep in my breast pocket. I screwed the cap back on and set the bottle down precisely where I had found it. Precisely, because a man who hides a safe behind a wall notices when the world is a half-inch out of place. And that is when the private elevator chimed. They were back early. My heart went off like a jackhammer. I shoved the tray into the safe, swung the steel door shut, kicked the wall panel back into its seam, and lunged out of the office into the short hallway just as the front lock disengaged. There was a fire stairwell door 6 feet away. I slipped through it and eased it shut behind me, leaving a half-inch crack, and pressed my back flat against the cold concrete wall a single heartbeat before Marcus rounded the corner into the living room. I heard him moving through the apartment. I heard him walk into the office. I heard the spring panel pop, the dial spin, and then the small electronic chirp of the burner phone waking up. I put my eye to the crack and my ear to the gap, and I listened to the man my daughter was going to marry conduct his business. His voice was low, clipped, all warmth gone. He confirmed to whoever was listening that the cake tasting had gone fine and that Claire was resting. And then he said the words that turned the concrete against my spine to ice. The dosage is perfect. Her heart rate's already dropping. Up at altitude, it'll read as natural. Textbook altitude sickness. Nobody looks twice at a flatlander who can't handle the Alps. I stood in that stairwell and did not breathe until I heard his footsteps move off toward the living room. Then I went down the maintenance stairs to the parking garage, out the service door, and across 2 blocks to where Everett waited. I dropped into the passenger seat, laid the 2 blue capsules on the console between us, and repeated every word I'd heard. Everett did not look surprised. He put the car in drive and said we were going to a private lab he trusted, and that we would not make another move until we knew exactly what was in those pills. The lab was a plain concrete building in a quiet commercial park, a sign on the door that read Advanced Analytical Shrewlussless. Everett walked me past the front desk to a forensic toxicologist named Dr. Nolan Whitfield, a quiet man with tired eyes who owed Everett a favor and asked no questions about where 2 unlabeled capsules had come from. He took them, sealed them into a tray, and told us the mass spectrometry would take 3 hours. Those were the 3 longest hours of my life. I paced a windowless waiting room and thought about Claire's gray skin, Claire's swimming eyes, Claire blinking at a waiter like a woman surfacing from deep water. When the door finally opened, Dr. Whitfield came in holding a stack of printouts, and he wore the expression a physician wears just before he delivers a terminal diagnosis. The blue capsules, he said, were not supplements. They were a precisely engineered pharmaceutical weapon. The primary compound was a heavy dose of a prescription beta blocker, a drug that suppresses the heart rate and drops blood pressure. The secondary compound was a fast-acting hypnotic sedative. On their own, at sea level, they would produce exactly what I had been watching for days: crushing fatigue, lethargy, a body that looked merely worn down by wedding stress. But Dr. Whitfield set the papers down and explained the murder hidden inside the chemistry. Take that same cocktail, he said, and carry the person rapidly up to high altitude, the thin air of the Alps. Up there, starved of oxygen, the human heart must beat faster to survive, but the beta blocker chains the heart down, forbids it to speed up. The body demands more, the drug refuses to allow it, and the resulting collision inside the chest produces sudden, catastrophic cardiac arrest. Untraceable, indistinguishable from a tragic natural death by altitude sickness in an inexperienced hiker, it was flawless. It was patient. It was, God forgive me for using their word, beautiful. The way a perfect trap is beautiful right up until it closes. Something in me came loose. I grabbed the edge of the steel table and heard a sound leave my body that I had never made before, and I threw that table across the room. I was done with plans and evidence and patience. I was going to drive back to that penthouse and put my hands around Marcus Doyle's throat and not let go. I made it to the door. Everett got there first. He threw his body against it, and when I grabbed his shirt to move him, he did not move. He was younger and stronger, and he pinned me to the wall and put his face close to mine, and what he said stopped me cold. If I killed Marcus today, he said, I would spend the rest of my life in a cell. Renata would vanish into the wind with the hidden assets and never answer for any of it. And Claire would be left alone, drugged, grieving, and freshly vulnerable to whatever was left of their network. You want to save her, he said, not avenge her. Those are different jobs, Walter, and only one of them keeps her alive. Then he lowered his voice and made me a promise instead. We would not brawl with these people. We would destroy them, legally, systematically, publicly. We would build them a cage out of their own arrogance and let them walk into it in front of every single person they had used. Only then would Claire truly be free. I let go of his shirt. The red drained out of my vision, and the cold engineer came back up to the surface where he belonged. I smoothed my jacket, I nodded, and we went to work on the trap. My first stop was my attorney, Sidney Park, a trust and estate specialist who had managed my affairs for a decade, and who went pale and still when I laid the whole nightmare across her desk. Her first instinct was the natural one. Tear up the medical power of attorney, call the police, stop the wedding by force. I raised a hand and stopped her. A frightened man shreds the document. A wise engineer who finds a fatal weakness in an enemy's stronghold does not seal the tunnel. He wires it and waits for them to walk in. If I blocked Marcus's paperwork now, I told her, he would know instantly that his cover was blown. He would abort, drain what accounts he could reach, and disappear before sunrise, and try again with some other family 1,000 miles away. I needed him to feel like he had already won. I needed him standing in a spotlight, pen in hand, in the exact moment he believed he was untouchable. So I asked Sydney to build something invisible. Buried inside the separate trust document Marcus would also sign at the rehearsal dinner, I wanted a clause, a poison pill drafted so cleanly that only a seasoned trust attorney could ever spot it. The instant his pen left the paper, that clause would nullify the medical power of attorney and simultaneously freeze every account attached to his name and his aliases. Sydney's fear gave way to something harder as she understood the elegance of it, and a grim little smile crossed her face. She promised it would be undetectable. Then she started typing, and I drove to the federal building downtown. I did not walk into a public lobby and fill out a complaint form. 15 years earlier, a brilliant young agent named Raymond Kessler had nearly been destroyed by a corrupt bureaucratic technicality, and I had quietly spent my influence and my money to see that he got a fair fight, a legal defense that saved his career and let him rise. Raymond Kessler was now the deputy director of the FBI's Dallas field office. He owed me a debt he had been waiting 15 years to repay, and that afternoon I finally called it in. Within 20 minutes I was in his soundproofed office, and I emptied my briefcase across his desk, Dr. Whitfield's certified toxicology report on the beta blocker and sedative cocktail, Everett's forensic accounting exposing the Shell empire and the felony record of Marcus Doyle, and the grainy Florida clipping, the drowned heiress, the surviving husband with his face in his hands. Raymond read it all, and I watched a career investigator connect the same dark line I had. Then he told me the hard truth. What I had was a textbook long con and a mountain of circumstantial evidence, but prosecuting a man for a murder that has not happened yet is nearly impossible. The Florida case was closed as an accident. A clever defense attorney could wave the toxicology away as a prescription mix-up. To put Marcus Doyle away for the rest of his natural life, Raymond said, they needed to catch him committing an undeniable federal felony in real time on the record. And Marcus was about to hand them one. Wire fraud and aggravated identity theft carry serious mandatory sentences. If Marcus knowingly signed fraudulent trust documents under a fabricated identity, intending to extract millions from a federally insured bank, the Bureau could move on the spot. The rehearsal dinner would be ground zero. Agents would infiltrate the ballroom as waitstaff, valets, and audiovisual techs. The room would be wired with hidden cameras and directional microphones, but the entire operation balanced on a single fragile point. Marcus had to pick up the pen and sign his false name of his own free will, feeling completely safe. If he sensed a fraction of danger, one wrong face, one held breath, he would refuse and the whole trap would collapse into nothing. Which meant the load-bearing member of a federal sting operation was going to be a 70-year-old man's ability to sit across a table from his daughter's killer, raise a champagne glass, and smile. I drove home as the sun went down bloody over the Texas horizon. I stood at my bathroom mirror and splashed cold water on my face and looked at the old man looking back at me, and I understood exactly what he had to do. He had to walk into a bright, crowded ballroom and break bread with the monster who was poisoning his child. He had to look into a serial killer's dead eyes without one drop of the ocean of rage inside him reach the surface. If his smile slipped, if his hands shook, if his voice carried a single grain of venom, Marcus would run. I adjusted my tie. I buried the terrified father somewhere deep below the waterline, and I brought the cold engineer up to stand watch. The drive downtown took 45 minutes, and I used every second to press my grief down under a thick, calm layer of surrender. I handed my keys to the valet, with my shoulders slumped and my steps heavy, and I walked into a rehearsal dinner that my own money had paid for. 150 of the most powerful people in Dallas, real estate barons and city officials and old society, sipping champagne beneath the chandeliers, extras in a play none of them knew they were in. Marcus found me before I reached the head table. He came out of the crowd in a tuxedo cut to flatter every line of him, a broad, magnanimous smile on his face, and he took my hand in a grip meant to remind me who had won. He thanked me loudly for the audience, the gracious son-in-law forgiving the difficult old man. And then he leaned in close to my ear and murmured, just for me, that he was glad I had decided to be reasonable. He smelled of expensive cologne and absolute certainty. I lowered my eyes and told him quietly that all I had ever wanted was for my daughter to be happy. It was the truest thing I said to him, and he heard it as surrender. Renata glided over in a crimson gown, 2 flutes of champagne in her hands, her dark eyes glittering with a greed she could barely keep behind her teeth. She pressed a glass on me and purred about how thrilled she was to see our families joined. I took the flute and I raised it to my lips and I let not one drop pass my teeth. When she turned, I set it untouched on a passing tray. Then I looked at the head table, and everything in me nearly came apart. Claire sat alone, in a high velvet chair in the middle of the celebration, and the drugs had done terrible work. My vibrant daughter looked like a candle, burned down to the last of the wick. Her eyes were sunken and dull, ringed in bruised shadow. Her skin had that translucent gray I had watched creeping in for days. She was trembling, gripping the edge of the table just to hold herself upright in the chair, lost somewhere in a chemical fog too thick to see the danger seated all around her. Every cell in my body screamed to gather her up and carry her out of that room. And then, at the edge of my vision, I caught it. A catering captain adjusting an earpiece that no caterer needs. A lighting technician against the back wall shifting a lens a few degrees. Raymond Kessler's agents were in position, woven invisibly through the room. The trap was armed. I took my seat beside my daughter. She turned her head slowly, found my face after a moment's delay, and gave me a faint, trembling smile. She whispered that she was glad I'd come. I squeezed her cold, clammy hand under the table, and made her a silent promise that the nightmare was nearly over. The dinner came in courses that tasted like ash. Marcus held court, charming the table with fairy tales of Providence money, leaning over now and then to kiss Claire's pale cheek, every tender gesture a fresh brick in his alibi. I ate nothing. I kept my eyes on the white tablecloth and played the broken, defeated father with the discipline of a sniper waiting on a single shot. And then, as the dessert plates were cleared away by federal agents in catering whites, Marcus rose from his chair with a fresh glass of champagne and tapped a silver spoon against the crystal. The sound rang across the room, and 150 faces turned toward the head table. He smiled that radiant, terrible smile, sweeping the crowd and finally settling it on me. In a booming, theatrical voice, he announced that before the dancing began, my wonderful father-in-law had a special gift to present to the happy couple, the formal signing of the family trust. He reached into his jacket and produced a leather portfolio. He slid it across the polished wood toward my hands, the lethal medical power of attorney on top, a heavy gold pen laid across it. And the whole room went silent and watched the defeated old patriarch prepare to sign away his empire and shuffle off into the dark. I picked up the pen. I turned it over in my fingers, slow, as though I were weighing the metal, and I let the silence stretch until it pressed on the room like a hand. 150 people leaned in. Marcus leaned in furthest of all, his composure cracking around the edges, his eyes locked on that pen with a hunger he could no longer hide. Beside him, Renata gripped the stem of her flute so hard I thought it might snap. They were waiting for the single stroke of ink that would crown their victory. I looked at my daughter one last time. Claire had slumped sideways in her chair, her eyelids fluttering, fighting and losing against the dose in her blood, with no idea that the paper in front of me was a death warrant written in her name. I took my eyes off her pale face and I looked directly at Marcus Doyle. And I set the pen down. I did not sign. I slid my chair back, the wooden legs shrieking against the marble, and I stood up to my full height, and I let the tired, broken old man fall away from me like a coat I had only been wearing for the crowd. I reached across the table and drew the small floral arrangement microphone toward me, the one the audiovisual technicians had placed there hours before, and I tapped it twice. The sound cracked across the ballroom like a gavel. I knew Raymond Kessler and his people were listening through every hidden earpiece in that room, waiting for the trigger. I looked out at that crowd of powerful strangers and then back at the man who was murdering my child, and I spoke in a voice that carried to the last row. 40 years ago, I said, I built my first skyscraper. I let that settle. Then I told them the first rule of my trade, the one I have never known to fail. You can pour a fortune into the finest materials. You can hire brilliant architects. You can polish the glass until the whole tower burns like a diamond in the sun. But if you pour your foundation over rotten soil, if the ground beneath it is a lie, then the building is already dead. It does not matter how beautiful it looks on the day you cut the ribbon. A structure built on a lie will always, always collapse under the weight of its own deception. I kept my eyes on Marcus, and I watched his smile die by degrees. The threat in the metaphor was not lost on a man who had spent his life building beautiful illusions over rotten ground. His jaw tightened. His eyes flicked just once toward the exit. I told the room that a family is a structure too, that it requires honest materials and a foundation poured in real love to stand through the storms that come for all of us. And I told them what happens when a parasite gets inside the walls. When something hollow starts quietly cutting the load-bearing members and replacing solid steel with rot, the whole building becomes a killing thing, a danger to every soul who trusted it enough to live inside. I raised the gold pen over my head like a piece of evidence, and I told 150 of the most powerful people in Dallas that the document on the table was not a gift to protect my daughter. It was a snare, engineered by a man who had perfected the art of predatory murder long before he ever set foot in Texas. The room broke into a low, confused murmur, half of them certain this was some strange scripted piece of the evening's entertainment. Renata shot to her feet in a rustle of crimson, her voice rising, telling the guests that the stress of the wedding had clearly caused the poor old man to suffer a breakdown, and she lunged across the table to snatch the portfolio out of my hands. I brought my left hand down flat on the document with a crack that rattled the crystal and froze her where she stood. I looked at her, and I let the last of the polite mask fall away, and I told her to sit down and be silent before she made things very much worse for herself. She saw something in my face then, and she sat. I turned back to Marcus. Every drop of color was gone from him. He was easing his chair backward, gathering himself to bolt for the nearest door. He knew. The jaws had already closed. He simply hadn't heard them yet. I held that gold pen over the signature line one last moment, while the entire room held its breath. And then I looked the man who had planned to murder my only child in his eyes, and I smiled, and I let him see it. I dropped the pen. It clattered across the polished wood and rolled off the edge of the table. I reached into my jacket, drew out my phone, and without a word, staring straight into his panicking eyes, I pressed one button on the screen. Every light in the ballroom went black. For one heartbeat, the only sound in that cavernous room was the sharp collective gasp of 150 people plunged into the dark. I stood perfectly still, my eyes already adjusting, and I heard Marcus give a short, dismissive scoff somewhere beside me, muttering about a blown fuse, a catering error, still certain he was in control of the story. He had no idea I had just lit the fuse under his foundation. Then a low mechanical hum rose from the ceiling, the big projector powering on, and a blade of white light cut through the darkness and struck the enormous screen behind the head table. The crowd shifted, murmuring, expecting a slideshow of the happy couple, sunset dinners and manufactured memories. Instead, the first image that filled that wall was a high-resolution scan of a Nevada marriage certificate, magnified until the black text was legible from the farthest table in the room. 2 signatures at the bottom, Marcus Doyle, Renata Doyle, filed 8 years ago. Then the slides began to move, and I narrated each one into that microphone in a voice as steady as a foundation. The marriage certificate, proving the loving sister who had chosen the wedding flowers, was in fact his wife of 8 years. The felony conviction record under the name Marcus Doyle, real estate fraud, elderly victims, 3 years served. Everett's forensic accounting, the shell companies, the river of stolen money running under a dead strip mall in Providence. Dr. Whitfield's certified toxicology report, the beta blocker, and the sedative, the murder hidden in the chemistry. And last, the Florida newspaper, the drowned heiress, 32 years old, and the same man on the same kind of dock with his face at his hands. 2 years and 1 identity ago. 150 of the most powerful people in Texas sat in the glow of that screen and watched a monster get skinned alive by the truth. And in the middle of the room, my daughter, my Claire, lifted her heavy head, and through the fog and the sedatives, her eyes moved from the screen to Marcus, to me, and I watched something break and something else wake up behind them. Marcus ran. He shoved his chair over and bolted for the service doors, straight into a catering captain who was no caterer at all, and 2 waiters who set down their trays and took hold of his arms. Renata turned for the main entrance and found Deputy Director Raymond Kessler standing in it. The bright house lights came up all at once, and the ballroom filled with federal agents who had been pouring wine and adjusting lights all evening long. I did not watch them read Marcus Doyle his rights. I had already turned away from him, because he had stopped mattering to me the instant the cuffs came out. I crossed to the head table, and I dropped to my knees beside my daughter's chair. Claire looked at me, and her cracked lips formed one word, "Dad?" And then she fell out of that chair and into my arms with a sob that I felt in my own chest, and I held her. I held my whole world, while the ballroom emptied and the agents bagged the evidence and the long nightmare finally began to end. We stayed in that ruined ballroom a long while after everyone else had gone. Overturned chairs, shattered flutes, trampled flowers across the marble, the wreckage of a celebration that had never been real. I wrapped my jacket around Claire's shoulders, and she leaned her head against my chest, and slowly, as the last of the sedative loosened its grip, her breathing steadied into something natural and human again. When she could finally speak, she apologized. She said it over and over, weeping into my shirt. Sorry for the last 6 months, for pushing me away, for dismissing every warning, for calling me a jealous, paranoid old man. She told me how Marcus had worked at her patiently, day after day, dripping poison in her ear, telling her I was only trying to control her money and ruin her happiness. She asked me how she could have looked into the eyes of a killer every single morning and seen nothing but a man who loved her. I took her face in my hands the way I did when she was small, and I told her the truest thing I know. I told her that predators like Marcus Doyle do not choose their victims because those victims are foolish or weak. They choose people exactly like her. People with kind, open, trusting hearts, precisely because that goodness is the thing they can turn into a blindfold. He didn't fool her because she was stupid. He fooled her because she was good, and he weaponized the best thing about her. That is not her shame to carry. It is his. And then I told her the other thing, the thing I need every parent and every child listening to this to hear. I told her that a father does not stop standing guard just because his child believes she is safe. That from the first moment I held her in that delivery room, my one job in this world was to be the thing between her and the dark. I told her I would tear down every tower I ever built and burn the whole fortune to ash before I would trade one breath of her life for any of it. A full year has passed since that night in downtown Dallas. The federal case moved like the machine it was. Faced with the toxicology, the recovered burner phone, the shell accounts, and a fresh line connecting Marcus Doyle to that accidental drowning in Florida, both of them took plea deals to escape the death penalty. They will spend the rest of their natural lives inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. They filed an appeal 6 months in, claiming I had framed them and fabricated it all. The judge read it and sent it back where it came from. Claire moved home for a while, into the house I built the year she was born, and I watched the color come back to her one slow week at a time. I watched the fog lift out of her eyes. Her gallery in the design district is thriving now, busier and brighter than it ever was before. On Sunday mornings, we sit out on the porch with coffee and talk about everything and nothing, the way we used to before grief and a con man came between us. I did not just save my daughter's life that night. I got my best friend back from the edge of a cliff she never knew she was standing on. And Salvatore Marino, the tailor, the old friend who trusted his own ears and shoved a stubborn old man into a dark room and refused to let him leave, has not paid for a meal or a drink anywhere in the city of Dallas since. I have personally seen to that, and I will go on seeing to it for as long as I am breathing. Sometimes the universe hands you a miracle wrapped inside the worst moment of your life. And when it comes disguised as a nightmare, you had better be quiet enough to hear it. So let me leave you with what that dark fitting room taught me, in case you ever find yourself standing where I stood. Predators do not arrive wearing warning labels. They come disguised as everything your child has ever hoped for. They use charm as a weapon and isolation as a tool, and they are patient, and they are calm, and they count on your fear of being called paranoid to keep you silent. If a charming stranger enters your family and the whole climate of it slowly turns to poison, if the person you love starts changing, pulling away, going quiet and gray, do not politely step back and mind your own business. Ask the hard questions. Trust the instinct that God gave a parent for exactly this reason. Gather your evidence in the dark if you have to. It is 1,000 times better to be the villain in your child's eyes for one hard month than to stand at their grave and know you saw the crack in the foundation and said nothing. I spent 40 years making sure the buildings I raised would never fall on the people inside them. It turns out the most important structure I ever protected was the one made of blood and love and Sunday mornings. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that a parent's love used wisely is the strongest shield there is, do me that favor now. Hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel so the next story finds you. And tell me down in the comments what city you're watching from tonight, because I read them, all of them, and I would like to know who was sitting with me while I told you this. Stay safe out there, trust your gut, and I will see you in the next one. This story is a work of dramatized fiction, written and edited by a human storyteller for this channel. While it draws on emotional truths that many families know all too well, grief, trust, the way love can be turned against us, the names, characters, businesses, and specific events are invented, and any resemblance to real people or actual incidents is coincidental. It was crafted by hand from a human heart for an audience of real people. If any part of it moved you, that feeling was the whole reason it was made. Thank you for listening.